Hi, how are you?
So first up, I'd just like to welcome you all to this fall's in-service in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. And this is the first in-service that we're doing through the Office for Campus Ministry. So we're really excited to have you all here. And we've got a great talk, very exciting topic that we're very excited to talk to you about evangelizing the young in darkened times. I do, as we start, I just want to welcome a few people that are new to our kind of community. Over the summer, Mr. Joe Austin, was hired. Where's Joe at? Right here, for mission integration, I think, for Aquinas Academy. Luke Crawford, they're going to be here about 3:30. So Luke Crawford and about 7 people from North Catholic will be here a little late. They get out at 2:50, so they be here around 3:30. So Luke is new, and he's Director of Mission Integration in Cardinal World North Catholic. We have Kyle Goldkamp. Kyle's over here. He's campus minister at Central Catholic. And we have some new chaplains. We have Father Mark Thomas, Central Catholic, Edgecombe Catholic, and Carlow University. So he's a very busy guy. We've got Father Kevin Dominic and Father Tom Lewandowski, who are the new chaplains at Sarah Catholic. Over here, Mike Halsey. They're not here today, but Mike said they're at Sarah, so they're the two chaplains there. And Father Ken Marlowitz at Seton. So some new people, new faces. So we welcome you to campus ministry. These are people that work in all the high schools, so please feel free to network with them, get to know them. They may be able to help with questions, bounce ideas off one another, and just know that we're here to support all of you any way that we can. Also, just want to make a note to congratulate, most of you know Miss Katie Hatton is now, she was married this summer, so she's, where's Katie at? There she is. Sorry, I just figured it's a big deal, so she's now Katie Matlack. So there's a lot of good, cool things happening here in campus ministry. This is the first, what I call campus ministry leadership seminar. Now, I'm not stuck to the name, but I like the idea, campus ministry leadership seminar. Okay, so what's a seminar? Real quick, it's usually something that's offered by a commercial or professional organization that has the function of bringing together small groups for recurring meetings, focusing each time on some particular subject. It's essentially a place where people can raise questions and solve problems together, and usually participants are not beginners in the field. So most of you who are working at the high schools are professionally teaching and working in campus ministry, and the student leaders who are here, you're learning skills to take with you in the future. So you're not a novice in the idea of campus ministry, and the idea of a seminar is to help all of us grow together. Leadership. Now, what's this whole thing about leadership? Leadership, for us, now, it's new campus ministry is no longer in the education secretary in the diocese. Now we're in the leadership development secretary. So this is our mission statement. And I thought if you haven't seen it, it's important to see. Don't worry, we're not going to quiz you on it or anything. But this is kind of my marching orders as a director of the office. We exist to form clergy and laity to effectively serve the Church of Pittsburgh with a particular emphasis on leadership. We model servant leadership which values individual gifts and talents of both clergy and laity in collaborative ways to promote their growth and skills in order to bring about the vision of the church alive. Rooted and teaches Jesus Christ, and the role of the church in today's world is articulated by Vatican II. We will work to develop resourceful and confident leaders integrating the human, spiritual, intellectual, and pastoral pillars of formation. Now, underlined there, those four pillars are the pillars of formation for priests and deacons and lay ecclesial ministers in the church. So each aspect, how do we help form them as human beings, mature human beings, spiritual, intellectual, and their pastoral ministerial abilities in what they do. Now this is a really big deal for campus ministry because why is, now there's like a full-time guy doing campus ministry. We're more engaged. We're trying to really like up things up and really get people excited. Why is the church doing this? Well, because when young people end up going into college, it seems there's some studies that are showing the first year in college, everything that's been done in catechesis, youth ministry, in the parochial life, within 1 year, a lot of people tend to become what we call nuns. They disengage from the church. It's amazing, all of that work, and then, within a couple of years, and studies are showing that young people aren't coming back. So leadership development within campus ministry is so important. What you do in your schools is so important because you're helping people encounter Jesus Christ. To be quite honest with you, let's think about it. If we have a Catholic high school and people aren't coming to know the Lord, it may be great if we teach people math, help prepare them for a career. But if they don't know the Lord, then why are we having Catholic high schools? Right? That's the fundamental thing. So leadership development, my passion, what really inspires me, what gets me excited to do what I do, is to help you be able to help people come to experience and encounter Christ, fall in love with Him, and follow Him in their lives. So that's kind of what the idea of these leadership seminars are. I'm playing around with it. I'm not like beholden to it, but I encourage and I ask for your feedback, for your participation, ideas on how to make these seminars so cool that twice a year you're like, these dates, they're on the calendar. I don't want to be anywhere else because it's going to be awesome. And anything you can do to help us, pitch ideas, I'm open to that. So, if you don't have my contact information, write it down right now so that you can get in touch with me. Because we want to hear from you. Chris and I are going to be coming, starting to schedule soon, some listening sessions and some meetings with you that we normally do in November and December. So you'll be hearing from us. But we want to do this a little differently. We want to just kind of see how things are going. I know you're all familiar with the email that went out, the campus ministers, team leaders. We got some good feedback from you. How effective are the ministry logs? So we're going to do them this year, and then we're going to meet this year. And we're going to talk about that stuff together to see what is working, what might need to be changed, and see how we can come up with a plan that's really responsive to you that helps you. So with that in mind, just a couple housekeeping things too. The 2014 and 15 logs, we've only got them from Central. So, yay for Central. Good job, Central. Yeah. The rest of you guys, the rest of the high schools, get them in. Email them to me so that we can see those. And then also, we've only got 3 logs from 2013, 2014. So, Central, Oakland, and Quigley. So good job, you 3. But the rest of you, oh, did you get it in? Okay, well, we'll figure that out, Kathy. Maybe there was a glitch. Sorry. So just get those into us so that we can start looking through that stuff and we can have a good conversation in the winter time. So with that in mind, the only other thing I want to say is on Facebook, because I tried to find some of you on Facebook, and I don't know if the names, like obviously the names, there's a lot of people with sometimes the same name, so I'm not sure if I got the right people. But if you in Facebook type in HS for high school ministry teams, I created a group page for campus ministry that's a closed page for high school. So I'd like to keep it to campus ministry leaders, ministry team leaders, chaplains, and student leaders. If you're engaged in student leadership, by all means, feel free to like that or request to be added to it, so that it's a way that we can share information, when we're not meeting. And the last thing, I just want to welcome Dr. Teddy, Don Teddy. I'm sure many of you know who he is. He's now the principal. What's your high school, Don?
Greensburg Central Catholic.
Greensburg Central Catholic. So they're guests, and just welcome them. They're here from Greensburg to come to the in-service. So thanks for coming, guys, and welcome to the Diocese of Pittsburgh, your neighboring diocese. So with that, I just want to get into the talk so that we can give Dr. Miller some time. There's a quote from Pope Benedict Emeritus. He says in number 2 of Porta Fidei, that it often happens that Christians are more concerned for social, cultural, and political consequences of their commitment, continuing to think of the faith as a self-evident presupposition for life in society. In reality, not only can this presupposition no longer be taken for granted, but it is often openly denied. Whereas in the past it was possible to recognize the unitary cultural matrix broadly accepted in its appeal to the content of the faith and the values inspired by it, today this no longer seems to be the case in large swaths of society because of a profound crisis of faith that has affected many people. That idea of a cultural matrix that unites people, a worldview. This is kind of a teaser of what we're going to be talking about with the Dark Ages today. So, one note, we're going to allow Dr. Butler to go till about 4 o'clock, so there's just going to be a slight change in the format today. We will start around 4 o'clock with evening prayer, and then just move the break and refreshments. And we can bring the refreshments and the break into the discussion, so that'll be kind of fluid at the end there. So just to let you know, we're going to go till about 4 o'clock. We will do evening prayer after the talk, so we'll be closer to the hour of evening prayer. I'd like to, before I introduce our speakers, to start with the invocation of the Holy Trinity with the Glory Be. Right. Glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be, world without end. Amen. Okay, great. So, Dr. Eric Miller, he's right here, and he is a professor, a local professor at one of our colleges here in the diocesan area of Pittsburgh. He's a history professor at Geneva College out in Beaver Falls? Beaver Falls. Where he's taught there since 1999. His research, writing, and teaching center on American intellectual and cultural history. His essays have appeared in a variety of publications, including Christianity Today, Books and Culture, and First Things. And Chris brought some of his books out there so you can take a look at them on the table. He is the author of Hope in a Scattering Time, A Life of Christopher Lasch, and A Glimpse of Another Land, Political Hopes and Spiritual Longings. He and his wife Denise, along with their 3 sons, live in Beaver Falls. He enjoys gardening, hiking, and strumming loudly on his guitar. So we have something in common there. So Dr. Miller, please welcome us.
Thank you. It was tempting to bring it too. What is that? Revisit the early 70s or something. It's good to be here, and I can't help but appreciate the fact that we're talking about darkened times a year after the Dark Ages really ended, which is when the Pirates made the playoffs again. After 20 years, and I can remember, does anybody else remember where you were the night in the Atlanta game 21 years ago? I had to go, I was in seminary, I was in Chicago, I was going to work as a security guard that night. I had to be there at midnight. My shift started. So it was like, what, 7th inning, 8th inning, it was 10:30, the Pirates had the lead. I was in 8th grade in 1979 when they won before, and I was, weeping tears of elation at that point, and then this long drought. So until 92. So I went to bed, assuming, of course, the game was in the bag. I woke up, I got to work, pre-internet era, you couldn't just find out like that what had happened, and somehow the news trickled in over the night that the dastardly deed had been done, and Sid Bream and all that stuff. So, I consider the real Dark Ages to be the 20 years between 1993 and 2013. I think the fact that they clinched on the very same day of the year seems way too much like what we would hope would be providence. God is obviously on the side of the Pirates this year. So anyway, and also this was very bucko gold to me. Just saying, but it hits me, talking about the Dark Ages, that it's an offensive thing today to say that we live in darkened times. It's not a universally accessible judgment. It's not something that people wake up every morning and think, boy, the days are dark, the night is long, and God help us. That doesn't seem to me to be the mood of the age that we're in. I think there's a lot of confusion. I think there's times where a lot of people feel as if there's oppression. But to say that we live in something like the Dark Ages doesn't make sense. And I think the main reason that it doesn't make sense is we already have the Dark Ages, right? Contrary to my earlier Pittsburgh-centric view of the world. The Dark Ages was when? 800? 400 to 800, 400. Some people think it was 400 until Voltaire was born, or Rousseau, or take your pick. Famous. And who gets to follow what gets to follow the Dark Ages in the secular version of the story? The Renaissance coming to life, which is an era of great hope in the secular version of the story, because it's the rediscovery of what? The Greek and Roman philosophy, right? Now, Christians have other versions of the story that we tell that puts, a different kind of emphasis in there. And then what gets to follow the Renaissance? Enlightenment. And I love even the Spanish phrase for the siglo de las luces, the century of the lights. And of course, there's Christian. This is a very complicated story of enlightenment, and Christians. Scholars and Christians in the age were very much enlightened by genuine developments that took place. I'm not to create kind of Manichaean story about what happened, but we know that whatever the Dark Ages were, they're not now, because we live after the age of the lights. We live in enlightened times. Whatever difficulties we may have, they're mainly, again, this is another version of the story, because of the kind of medieval forms of religion. Just to say medieval in the secular context gives it a kind of dark cast, right? The medieval forms of religion that are being practiced out there that are threatening us. Fundamentalism, right? Another great word. There's a Harvard professor, he's an Orthodox named George Florovsky, who said, they call me a fundamentalist because I believe in God. It's this sort of sense that religion really is the enemy. So to claim we live in darker times is something that requires some finesse in our day with the focus on evangelism, right? If we're just talking amongst ourselves, and we can have arguments about this, whether we really do live in darker times. The idea actually came from Father Billy, who was referring to an author, a German author named Hannah Arendt, a philosopher, who wrote a book called Men in Dark Times. This is probably her most famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, which we'll talk about in a minute. But at any rate, I think that Christians, going back to the New Testament, think of the age that we're in as one that's threatened by darkness. And so I think the darkened times is apt, darkened. It's not pitch black, right? Arise, shine, for your light has come. We're going to end there. But we live in a time where we have difficulties. And I think our particular era that we're in has difficulties that are perhaps, in their own way, unprecedented. That's what historians' job is to try to do, is to figure out how eras are distinct from one another. And I think we're seeing things and are part of things that humans haven't experienced before because of the distinctive features of modern life. I have a quote here that if you can look at that with me. This is a rather brazen judgment of the times by the guy whose biography I wrote, Christopher Lasch. He was not a Christian. When he wrote this, he was sort of a recovering Marxist who had been reading a lot of Orestes Brownson. Some of you know, and people like Hannah Arendt, Jonathan Edwards, Alistair McIntyre. And Lasch writes this in his book from 1991. He said, "The unexpectedly rigorous business of bringing up children exposed me," he was born in 1932, children born in the 60s mainly, "as it necessarily exposes almost any parent to our child-centered society's icy indifference to everything that makes it possible for children to flourish and grow up to be reasonable adults." To see the modern world from the point of view of a parent is to see it in the worst possible light. This perspective unmistakably reveals the unwholesomeness, not to put it more strongly, of our way of life, our obsession with sex, violence, and the pornography of making, our addictive dependence on drugs, entertainment, and the evening news. our impatience with anything that limits our sovereign freedom of choice, especially with the constraints of marital and family ties, our preference for non-binding commitments, our third-rate educational system, our third-rate morality, our refusal to draw a distinction between right and wrong, ... He actually goes on for another, paragraph. Does this resonate with anyone? This is something that somebody could see looking perhaps through Christian eyes without necessarily owning the faith himself. I think he might have even gone so far as to say that. But he makes claims in here that are pretty strong. He wants us to think that they are, what's the word he says here, unmistakably, this perspective of the parent unmistakably reveals the unwholesomeness. Do you think he's right on that? Does the perspective of a parent today unmistakably reveal the unwholesomeness of our way of life? Are there parents who would disagree with that? I think there's parents who would think he's really wrong. That being a parent doesn't reveal that there's anything necessarily wrong with our way of life. He's operating on some assumption that there's a kind of universal moral sense that we have as people, and that if you only would really be a real parent or a true parent, or you would see this. And I think that that's an optimistic view of how we look at things. And what I'm going to challenge us to think about is how we can integrate, through a deeper immersion, Christian language, Christian vocabulary, and Christian story into the way we describe our age and our times in such a way that it will force people to ask themselves whether they've really understood the times that they're living in, right? That in order to make this thing happen, to reach people, to evangelize people, our own children, the children in the neighborhood, the children beyond, we have to find ways, this is what my challenge is, we have to find ways to convey the gospel that are rich in texture, that are deep in meaning, and that have a profound ability to both converse within our Christian tradition, right, as well as extend into a world that has less and less contact with Christian tradition in any significant sense, right? So how can we get vocabulary? How can we master languages? How can we come into philosophical perceptions that take us deeper into the Christian story and into deeper contact with the world that we're living in, right? With its bumps and bruises as well as all of its promises. Roman numeral 2, language, judgment, and story, just to get us thinking about this a little bit, it might be worth a minute or two just to think about the power of fluency. Why is it that we struggle with reaching people beyond our pale? Why is it that we struggle with reaching our own children? Maybe it's because we don't speak the Christian language as fluently as we think we do. Okay? Just an example of this about language. A few years ago, I had this, I don't know how to describe it. I would say it was an epiphany of sorts. Who's the 19th century poet who talks about inscape and
Gerard Manley.
Yeah, Gerard Manley talks about this. I had this epiphany where that became very real to me, that that part of the natural world had this, I guess it has to do with sacramentality, the reality of creation, but all of a sudden trees became very real for me. I'm like 40, I'm like 43, 44 years old. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, my goodness, trees exist in a way that I didn't perceive before. This sounds a little fluky and sketchy, just hang with me a little bit. So I told my wife for my birthday that I wanted to get a book that would help me to learn the names of trees. That I've been alive on this earth for 4 decades, and I haven't really cared whether I passed a maple or an oak or a hemlock or whatever it was, but now I do. And I started to learn the names, right? And the trees themselves started to become distinct to me. Has anybody had any experience like this at all? Maybe you've had it with animals, right? With dogs, birds, they sort of, and it was an amazing gift. That things that just looked ordinary, or that my mind had written off, had now become actually something like living beings. And I was at the same time reading Tolkien. And you can't read Tolkien very long without realizing the kind of deep sense of texture that he gives to the reality that he creates. And so when I'm having this kind of tree awakening, and I'm reading. Okay, now it's going to skip my mind. Who are the trees? The talking trees.
Ents.
The Ents. Yes, the Ents. And I just found myself kind of impassioned with these Ents, and I realized, my goodness, I'm an Ent. Historians are Ents. You know, we talk about going up there, but this is a key point. To get into that relationship with trees, I had to acknowledge them as something other than objects from my own imagination that I could just write off. They had to become real to me, and once they became real to me, I had to connect language for that reality to them, for that reality to actually sink in, right? That's what naming is all about. Naming, and that's why, my son, I have a son in a sophomore college studying English, God help him. Actually, I mean that really. Just started to date a girl named Savannah. What a beautiful name. I used to live in a place that was Savannah. But I was struck by how the name really matters when you're in that dating relationship, right? The name matters. The name connects you to that person. You don't date, hey you, I hope, right? Other things happen with hey yous that we don't like and don't want to talk about, right? No, the name is a humble submission to the otherness of this person, to the createdness of this person, right? So how well do we know how to name the reality that we're seeing? Are we fluent in languages that can help us to make contact with people in a way that will take them into this reality in a way that Tolkien, and I think it's not an accident, by the way, Tolkien studied languages professionally for decades, right? This is what facilitates for him the imagination that makes the connection possible. So that probably the greatest apologist in a certain sense of the 20th century, right, is J.R. Tolkien, in terms of reaching people with the vision of the gospel through his books, right? But it came through language, okay? I'll just give another quick example about this. When I was in high school, I lived in Brazil. My parents, I was one of 4 kids, and my mom and dad had to, we all learned Portuguese. And my dad's from Bedford County. Anybody know where Bedford is? Philadelphia to the east, Pittsburgh to the west, and Alabama in the middle. That's what Brooke says. That's where Bedford is. It's Appalachia. Pretty rough world in a lot of ways. A lot of virtues, but tenderness not being one of them. In the obvious sentimental senses, at least. When I got older in college, and my dad wanted to communicate with me tenderly, guess what language he turned to? Portuguese. No. Portuguese. Right? That there was something possible through the Portuguese language that he was able to connect to me with, that his experience of his culture, speaking that particular language, that particular variant of English, was really hard for him. It matters what languages we speak. Certain languages emerging from certain cultures take with them certain kinds of capacities, right, to explain what's happening. And then there's also this other thing that languages can shrink. Languages can lose words. We're in the process of losing hundreds of words, right, in English. We're in the process of losing hundreds of languages right now in the world. So languages aren't static. They don't stay in place any more than cultures do. They're all interconnected. So I think, to get to this point, I think that what's happening, to go to letter B, on Roman numeral 2 on the second page, is we have competing stories and we have competing languages. And in the process is this great de-Christianizing that's taking place with Christianity as a source, Christianity, the Christian faith as the kind of grand, providing all kinds of archetypes for the Western imagination. with this hemorrhaging that's taking place, or this diminishing or reduction of Christian presence and influence, we're of course losing Christian language, and I say we very intentionally. We all are, Christians and non-Christians. We have to cultivate vocabularies and languages to be able to maintain the Christian culture, right? One of the interesting things about saving languages, I heard a linguist say this. I didn't. It was so counterintuitive that I was kind of tempted to doubt it. Well, I still am. But anyway, according to some expert, once tribal situations, once tribes learn Scripture, they have a better chance of saving their language. Like the kind of post-colonial Western imperial idea is that once you take the Bible into a place, they're going to lose their culture because they're going to become Christianized, right? But according to him, historically, once they have the ability to learn their own language, have their Scripture translated into their own language, then they'll keep their language. There's a logic to that. That's what we need to be about. We need to be carefully, self-consciously preserving our language against the competing stories. The competing stories are legion, right? But I think a few dominant ones. There's a kind of liberal, progressive story. I don't mean liberal in the Democratic or Republican sense, but just kind of liberal in the kind of liberal democracy sense, that we're getting better through science and technology. So anything that came before is on the other side of history. We believe that carries with it a language. We stop speaking Christian, okay, unless we're very careful about that. There's the great post-apocalyptic story, right, the tragedy, that we have been abandoned in the universe, we're in the midst of our own devices that are going to kill us, surely in the end, and there's no one, capital N, capital O, out there to actually help us, right? So we have all this, the phenomenon of post-apocalyptic literature and film. Rarely, although it happens, something comes along that makes into this there's a kind of like redemptive element. I'm thinking of The Children of Men. Has anybody seen that film? I think it's from T.D. Jakes. Is that
P.D. James.
P.D. James. Who's T.D. Jakes? There's some
Pleasure.
that TV. Yeah, The Children of Men. It's well worth watching, and it gives us sort of powerful redemptive thread in this post-apocalyptic vision. I think it's very powerful. There's a kind of static story. Think of the pagan story that human history just goes around and around and around. Things don't really get better. Things don't really get measurably worse. We just kind of change the objects that we use, the toys that we play with. These are powerful stories that infiltrate our imaginations by people who are getting paid millions of dollars to shape our imaginations, right? If we don't take very self-conscious measures to do that, we're not going to be able to name darkness as darkness, right? Or if we do name it as darkness, we won't see darkness in the light of the sun, right? We'll see darkness in this kind of secularistic, post-apocalyptic, or pagan, or whatever version of it is. So that's this starting point here. We need truer languages and truer stories. And how do we go about doing this? I think catechesis, already been mentioned by Deacon Alex, catechesis, I think, is proven through the history of the church to be something that we cannot live without. If we do not teach our children, if we don't teach our new converts catechism, kind of basic foundational Christian teaching, then we're not going to furnish them with the language they need to perceive what's happening. My favorite story about catechism, we were teaching our first catechism, and he was about 3. And his mother and I one day were having quite a little conversation, shall we say. It was going back and forth with increasing intensity. And there he was wandering around in the room where we were talking, yelling. And there was a break in the action. His name's Ian. And Ian said, and I can't think about this without it grabbing me. He says, God is everywhere. Which was an answer to one of his questions. In that moment where he needed, perhaps for himself to feel like there was something bigger than his parents who were controlling the reality of goodness, but maybe, and I think this may even be be truer, to comfort his parents, the Spirit brought this to mind. But if that language had never been learned, he wouldn't have been able to think that. That's so basic, but that's true. Catechesis matters. Now, as we get older, I think it still matters, and that's where I think you and I have a job to do. We teach. We have to find ways, creative ways, to make catechesis necessary and good and desirable and attractive. But I think that's crucial. I think enrichment is part of having truer language and true stories. By enrichment, I mean just exposure to those writers and artists and thinkers who just have ways of taking you into the world that restores enchantment and mystery and awe. Right? I'm thinking I have a couple of ideas down there in film. Has anybody seen Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life? Oh my goodness, I'm going to show that at the end of my class in U.S. Cultural History. Now Malick is, I don't know what his religious biography is, but I can tell you he's thought a lot about religion, and you can't watch that film without being challenged in some profound ways in terms of religion. Christian Wyman was the editor of Poetry magazine, was raised Pentecostal in Texas, left the Christian faith within, he says, about 2 weeks of arriving in college. Set out on the ambition to become a world-class poet, and did, by the time he was in his mid-30s. And he was diagnosed with cancer on his birthday, age 39, and he had gone through a period of great dryness, artistically, intellectually, and the lights came back on for him. He's now teaching at Yale Divinity. I don't know if he has a denominational affiliation, but he's been writing powerful poems and essays in the Atlantic and all kinds of places. And he's been publishing. He had been not publishing poetry for a long time. His re-entry to the church has been writing all kinds of stuff. Charles Taylor, Catholic Canadian philosopher, most famous, no doubt, Christian philosopher of our day, written a book called A Secular Age that has had to be covered and reviewed in all across the board. Christian publications, non-Christian publications, thinkers. It's about this thick. Good news. A philosopher named James K. Smith has just published a book called How Not to Be Secular, Reading Charles Taylor. It's a book about Taylor that Charles Taylor himself likes, who's been interviewed by Smith about it. David Brooks is quoted from Smith in the New York Times trying to figure out what Taylor's up to. What I love about this is it reminds me of, one, that if you really do get deep enough into it and you create cultures in which we can train people to think and see the world Christianly, then a Charles Taylor, by God's grace, is going to emerge every now and then and put the gospel on the table in the way that Alistair McIntyre did, the Notre Dame professor 30 years ago with his book After Virtue. Right? But I also love this book because it reminds me that there are so many great resources within the Christian institutional nexus, publishing houses, magazines, that can help us jump into this process of training our minds and deepening our perceptions. So whether it's Paulus Press or Erdman's publishes this, there's all kinds of resources out there to help us get to the place where we are. Okay, does this make sense? Is this resonating? Christian language, Christian thinking, this has to be a very self-conscious effort, and it's an adventure, right? That requires a kind of willingness to move into mystery and complexity, right? Okay, so that's all kind of a big setup for what I hope will become the main thrust of our discussion following our break, and that is this question. Okay, no, I didn't get to my other two. Okay, I just quickly say 3 koinonia, the Greek word for fellowship, 4 witnesses. Yeah.
If it's all right with everyone, maybe give you 10 more minutes.
Sure.
So he can elaborate this, because we did start a little late today. So with everyone's consent, all right, good.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, time's fine. Okay, so koinonia, the Greek word for fellowship. The great thing about this, and read Hebrews, the letter to Hebrews, which is embracing and remarkable, to try to capture a different story of what's happening, but in this massively important story of the author of the Hebrews is telling us, he says, do not forsake the gathering together with one another. Why? Because if you fail to do that, you will fall away, fall into darkness or hardness. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say is we can't just sit around and read books and watch films, right? We have to do this. We have to be together, and that quickens the spirit, much in the same way that witness does. And Andrew Walls is a historian of mission, I believe Scottish, who's lived in Africa. Andrew Walls says that the academic disciplines have actually developed historically following the trail of Christian mission. That as Christians have gone into the world to try to reach the world, it's exposed the ways that we need to develop our understanding of the world to be able to take the gospel into them, right? So that, again, that flies in the face of the enlightened story that kind of says that all good things started to happen once we forgot about God, right? The real story, according to Andrew Walls, is when we actually take God into the world, when we take the cross of Christ into the world, it exposes darkness with light. And then we begin to see how we need to develop what there is to see in terms of things like languages and biology and sociology and all these kinds of things. So as we engage, as we're in fellowship, right, as we're engaged in witness, we become quickened and we can actually receive the language that we're learning theologically or literarily. Okay. So freedom's dark age. This is the question. How do we then take our kind of quickened, deepening awareness into places that need to have the gospel? How do we do that in very real ways, in very tangible, palpable ways? Well, I think one thing that we can do is find the parts of a given culture or community that seem to have some kind of philosophical electricity connected to them. There's something that's beyond just the needs of the body or the pleasures of the body or whatever it is that captures people's imagination. Because wherever you find that, you have a gateway to the gospel. And I think that in our context, one of those key areas or key ideas that still excites us as Americans and that can cause us to feel indignant or can cause us to feel a kind of enthusiasm is the idea of freedom. Somehow freedom still packs a philosophical punch for us. You can actually get into arguments about something in America besides concussions or Ray Rice or or whatever. You can get it, and actually the reason why we're having arguments about Ray Rice has to do with freedom, I think at some level, with human dignity, right? So I think freedom is something that we can seize on, and with a kind of heightened, deepened Christian vocabulary, theological awareness about what we mean by freedom, we can engage, because this matters to us. Somehow freedom is still centered in our identity. Somehow freedom is still doing work out there. Freedom is what's advancing the cause of gay marriage, right? No doubt about that. It's only because there's this philosophical ballast associated with the idea of freedom that we have this kind of sense of a moral cause that's out there. My family and I were vacation on Cape Cod a few years ago. We were camping on the north end of the island, or the Cape, and close to Provincetown, which is where the Pilgrims once landed, but it's now a sort of arts community center. It's a big kind of retreat center for, vacation center for a lot of the gay population. Well, I don't know for a lot of the population, but that's the kind of site that it is. It's become. And so we were riding bikes around, and we went past the Pilgrim Monument, this massive granite structure that you can go to the top of and see. It's very beautiful. And at the bottom of it, there was a public protest taking place by an organization called Freedom for Families. Freedom for Families. It was about gay adoption. And this is 3 years ago, so things have advanced since then. But I thought it was very fitting that was taking place at the base of the Pilgrim Monument, because somehow we associate freedom with the Pilgrims, right, religious freedom, and we associate a lot of these same causes with this version of this ideal of freedom. Is that the only way to think about freedom, though? Right? Well, Christians, of course, don't quite see it that way, right? Christians see freedom in ways that are more complicated than the narrative about human rights. Okay, so if you look down to letter B on Roman numeral 3, just to throw some stuff out there that we can use and this we can turn to for discussion. I'm going to say that the land of free has actually become a tough place for people seeking freedom. That's what Christopher Lasch is saying in that first quote. He turned back to there. He says, our society's, he talks about in the second line, our society's icy indifference to everything that makes it possible for children to flourish and to grow up to be responsible adults. Parents, he's saying, aren't free to help their children to become what they need to become in order to know freedom. The freedom that comes with living the way we're supposed to live. But the reason that version of freedom is threatened is in the second underlined phrase from that quotation, that we believe we have a sovereign freedom of choice. What we have here are two dueling versions of freedom that we don't know quite what to do with. Isaiah Berlin talked about positive freedom versus negative freedom. Positive freedom being freedom that helps us to be able to do something, that gives us the possibility of doing something, the freedom to become what you were meant to be, the freedom to become, the calling that you have, versus freedom from something, freedom from the thing that's keeping me from realizing my freedom. We have this tension here. We have such an emphasis, Lasch is saying, on negative freedom, no one get in my way. That mentality is making it hard for us to become what we need to become in order to be free. If that makes sense. More theologically, this is an Augustinian formulation. We tend to confuse these two meanings of freedom, right? Freedom as license versus freedom as submission, right? We think that being able to do whatever I want to do will make me feel free, right? That's kind of like a common, just kind of cultural truism. Freedom to do whatever I want to do is real freedom. But Christians say that kind of freedom will lead you to what? Bondage, slavery. A woman shows up at a counselor's office, Christian counselor's office, says, my life's a mess, I don't know, it's the true story, I don't know what to do, I feel so empty, I feel so hollow, I'm depressed all the time, I can't sleep. Well, what's your life like? Well, I party on the weekends, I drink a lot, I have sex, But why don't you stop that? You mean I don't have to do that stuff? True story. If you don't think that's true, go to your neighborhood high school. Ask a 16-year-old what she feels like she has to do on the weekend. Or should do, even. Right? The Christian gospel is premised on the idea that we can only know freedom as we submit to the one who made us, and then are thus able to live as our Creator made us to live. That freedom is living according to that design. But we're caught up in this tangle, right, of how do we reconcile freedom in our pluralistic age with, religious plurality and secular and non and all this kind of thing. These are really complicated questions that obviously you're going to sort out, not me. But my deeper point is this, that if we become really keenly, acutely aware of how Christians have thought about freedom, it will help us to engage people living in a culture where we don't really feel free in the deepest sense, right? Where we have a deep sense of loneliness that certainly is the opposite of freedom. So, in the end, our light has come, right? Christ, the light shines in darkness. Here we are. Thank God, right? But Christ adds this admonition in the Sermon on the Mount. In the same way, your light must shine in people's sight, so that seeing your good works, they may give praise to your Father in heaven. Something that Peter is going to say much the same way, and in a few decades after this, repeating this, right? That even though our light has come, it's really clear that we Christians need to be shining that light, and that requires that we be as wise as serpents, as gentle as doves as we do that. So part of the seminar, part of the point of the seminar, I think, is to try to find ways to do that in the particular places where we're called to shine that light. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff that's put there. Maybe just to kind of rewind the pump a little bit, to try to capture our task of getting another story in place so that we have something to talk about when we're in the midst of our work of evangelism. The first letter A on the Roman numeral 3, which is on page 2, have an insight and a metaphor to try to help us think about what the big story that we might, if we're not telling the big story of progress through science, or the big story of apocalypse through science, or the big story of no story, that everything stays the same. Well, what is the story? Well, Roger Lundeen, who's a literary scholar, who's a Christian, puts it this way, try to explain what's happened. He says, for countless centuries, men and women had believed themselves called to reconcile their inner lives with higher purposes beyond themselves. Now, at last, they no longer needed to trouble themselves, once we became modern, with trying to bring their longings as subjects in line with the meaning of objects. Okay, that's a little tricky, but I think that what he's trying to get at here is the dominant perception, and this goes back to pagan times, in certain dimensions of pagan societies and other religions, is that what I am as a subject needs to be lined up with something beyond me as a subject. But there's some authority in the world itself that I must align myself to, submit to. I must find myself, I must pursue a kind of harmony with. That may require sacrifice, that may require blood, whatever. But this has been the dominant perception, perhaps even instinct, of human beings. That's what's lost. That's what makes our times distinct. He says, now there's no need for me to know myself as anything other than a subject. There's no meaning in the objects around me, whether they're trees, right? Whether they're stars, whether it's gods, divinities, whatever. There's no meaning out there. There's just meaning within. Boy, that's a big story change. How to reinvite awareness of ourselves as subjects who need to seek harmonic union with something beyond the self, even if it requires atonement, even if it requires propitiation, whatever theological language, but very, very crucial, right? To try to figure out what's happening to us. And then the other one is by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre of Notre Dame, published this landmark book in the early 80s called After Virtue. It was talked about in newspapers around the country. It made such an influence. Actually, that was England, not this country. But and his thesis is this, that what we mean by modern is that there's something like a great catastrophe that has taken place. He compares it to what would happen if there was a series of environmental disasters in which all of our knowledge of science, after which our knowledge of science goes kaput. We don't understand how it is that we made everything after all these calamities that take place on the earth. But we still use the words without really knowing what the words mean, without having sophistication. He says that's exactly what's happened to us morally. We still use language that sounds moral, that has to do with virtue or character, or words like kindness or compassion, or things like this, or justice, but we don't have a sense of the whole anymore. That's been smashed. It's in smithereens. Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy, says that there is a huge and heroic sanity of which moderns can only collect or see the fragments. There is a huge and heroic sanity of which moderns can only see the fragments. So that sense that things have been fractured so that we can't see whole. This helps to explain this idea of darkness, right? If you can't see, you're blind, right? If we can't see what's around us. It also gives us a challenge or a way to think about how to pursue evangelism. So my suggestion is that we talk about freedom as a way to try to think about how to make conversations, develop arguments, create stories that can that can present another vision of freedom that challenges some of our existing ideas. So we have 4 questions at the end there. And what I think would be good is if you just read through, everybody just kind of read through them, and then just start talking about one at your table or somebody at your table thinks is particularly relevant or that strikes some kind of response, and we'll see where we go with that. Does that sound good? That sounds good. Okay.
What I'd like to do is just go around the table because we've got about 7 minutes before 5, so we're going to leave. We're going to leave real soon. Why don't we get this table? You guys are heading out right now.
They have to go. They have to go to
All right. You want to share just one thing or one concept from one of the questions. So if you can give the question that you want to answer, and then what do you want to share, and then we'll just go around this way.
All right, I'll do it. So we did question 1. I figured it was a good place to start. So what do you see as ways we in America understand freedom well? How do we tend to misunderstand it? Well, first we were saying the general idea that freedom is just being able to do whatever you want, but then we said, well, within reason. But then the question is how do you determine what's reasonable? And then we said even within freedom and a lot of advancements we've made, that even with so many advancements, there's good things, but we have to recognize like the limitations too. And with those limitations, just really finding out what's the good in maybe like the old ways of doing something, or keeping a sphere of influence smaller. For instance, like allowing the scope of your freedom to be influenced by your family, the smaller culture around you, rather than so many other inputs. Like really being aware of keeping the things that influence you like a smaller, keeping it to a smaller sphere, rather than like all these being bombarded by so many different things. Like field hockey.
There you go.
Okay.
So basically, looking at how to kind of censor who's the one making things reasonable to you. So if this is a reasonable thing to do, who's telling you that? Is it your faith? Is it your family? Or is it some masked person behind the screen on social media and a website saying this is what fulfillment is? And how do you discern what that is? What's true and good, and what's maybe not so true and good, or deceitful, or wrong? Okay, great, thanks. So let's go to this table here. What questions do you think you guys want to talk about, and what insight do you want to share with the group about what questions? So,
well, I'm not sure we answered a particular question, but we had a discussion about, we started out talking about beauty. I guess you could answer question 4, how might Christians shine light on our darkness? And we were talking about the desire to, maybe it's, read great literature or see, great art or sacred music or whatever the thing may be. Sometimes we have our nose stuck in our books so much that we don't, we're thinking about, academic excellence in school, and so hard to sometimes take a step back and observe the beauty of what we're learning or what we're seeing, and so trying to create time to take a step back and have that sense of awe or contemplation is a very challenging concept, I think, in education. So that was kind of
good. And then how do you think that can help shed light in the darkness of the age? How can you maybe try to connect that?
I think just being aware of that. We didn't get too far into the conversation, but my sense would be just being aware of that and trying to allow, I think maybe from an administrator point, to try to create space in the academic day for students to do that. And I think for students to, be intentional about, let's enjoy, wow, this is amazing, we get to talk about this piece of literature or whatever it is. And appreciate the connections that are made to our faith, and be able to enjoy that as opposed to thinking about the grade.
Gotcha. So maybe to try to tie it in with Eric's talk, into the idea of enrichment, that the beauty or the literature or the art or whatever it is that you learn helps you articulate something that's light-filled rather than dark. And then in a relational context with others, you can be that light. Is that fair? I think that's fair. Sum that up. All right. Great. So good. We got 1 and we got 4. Now you can answer another of the same questions. That's because I'm answering the table. But what would you guys like to talk about? What would you want to share with your group at this time?
Anybody want to speak? No? Well, we talked about 1 and 2 mainly, but number 2, I asked the students if they felt it was harder with Christian values and freedom, the vision of freedom, or easier. And they all felt it was kind of harder because of the rules. And the fact that, there's a certain direction from a Christian vision of freedom that maybe some people have a difficult time with, and realizing what that direction could be. And so we went from 1 to 2, and the second question was kind of an interplay off of number 1, because we talked about choice and opportunities, things of that come free for all. So I thought that the students made a good point about the difficulty sometimes of living a Christian free life, and sometimes it's easier, but most of the time they felt it might be harder. So it kind of goes back to the idea that, the darkened times may come from the fact that it's not always clear of what the idea of what Christian freedom is, what living with freedom and living with faith connected to. So that has to be defined, and that's one of the cultures we do in Catholic schools, is trying to define that for people who come to our schools.
It's very good. Thank you. Yeah, if I could just add on to that a little bit. In my own spiritual journey, what I found is in the last number of years, I've experienced a sense of freedom where I would say it's like what we call in the Byzantine tradition apathy, where apathy comes from. It doesn't mean you don't care about something, but it means you're not disturbed by all the things that are going on in life, like this thing or that desire or whatever. And there's a smoothness, a levelness. And I found that peace, that's what I kind of identify right now as like Christian freedom. And what you're talking about, Dawn, is I think very important just to name it. Well, what is difficult about it? Well, sin. Sin's what's difficult about it. There's the desire, you want to do the other thing that you can't do, and it's hard. And it's really hard in today's age because the idea of what truth is blurred. And then you have all these other competing stories, and ideas that are saying, no, this is what you want. This is the the way, the path. And let's reflect on that theologically. There's the path. There's 2 paths. There's the narrow and the broad. The broad way is easy for people to follow. The narrow path of Christ, it is a cross. It is difficult, but the flip side of it is what's attractive about it is, wow, imagine if you're that oak tree, that's just rooted, and you're able to help heal and bring peace to other people because you're at a point where you have a freedom. That's awesome. That's contagious, and that's worth it. It's worth the no or the bigger yes. So thank you very much for articulating that. This table here. What would you think?
Yes, we spent a good amount of time discussing question 1. We kind of started with the second part of it, kind of expounding on what was given in Dr. Noah's talk, because it seems like, as young people, we kind of agreed that it seems like there's a lot of people, especially young people, who are really enthused about being activists for various causes, whether it's the freedoms, the quote freedoms of people to choose, like homosexual lifestyles, or like the freedom of being pro-choice for women, or to make choices about their own body, or even just like everyday freedoms. Pretty much the idea that nobody's going to tell you what to do, but how that freedom in that sense is confused, that the term loses its meaning, because that sort of freedom doesn't lead you into true freedom. You become bonded by the lifestyle you create for yourself. You sacrifice your own freedom in that capacity. But then moving back to the first part of the question, we all agreed that in America, we're still very blessed to be able to enjoy a lot of the freedoms that we do. We looked at some of the other examples that are taking place in the Middle East and other countries. Since we live in a country where we have these sort of freedoms that not everybody else enjoys, we have a responsibility to make sure we preserve those and use them as they're meant to be used. So.
Okay, put you guys on the spot a little bit. Help us articulate, since we've articulated how we tend to misunderstand freedom. How as Americans do you think we understand freedom well? Can you flesh that out?
Yeah, that was the one I think we struggled a little bit more because it's easy to point out bad examples. But I think, to understand freedom well means to exercise it as it's meant to be exercised. So, if you have religious freedom, that means you practice whatever religion it is to the best of your ability. If you have freedom of speech, you use it consciously, and you use it well to communicate with other people, to settle differences, and to help spread good news. I don't know, do you guys have anything else that you want to share in that regard?
Those are two good, freedom of speech and freedom of worship. Those are two very good things for freedom.
I think at our table, when we were talking about that, the possibility of becoming what you were made to be, America, professionally and career-wise, but, that's, a story we hear in America all the time, the underdog rising up, overcoming obstacles, but there is a kind of freedom that other cultures at other times haven't had, where you were much more trapped, and that wasn't, that was more a remote possibility or an impossibility.
So, self-determination on a certain level we understand that well on a certain level, but there's obviously some sort of tipping point where that can become harmful as well.
Yeah, we transpose it into other categories where it doesn't apply.
This is, I think, very good, because we hear that, just last week we were hearing that children were being beheaded, in Syria and in areas of Iraq because they're Christian or they don't subscribe. Now, that doesn't happen, praise God, here. That's a good thing, So, yeah, I think America, we can definitely put ourselves down in a certain sense, but there's a lot of things that we have to, I think, recognize that are good, that we understand freedom well. And how can we use that to transform, to make it light? So, can I just go just a little bit deeper? So if anyone else that wants to share some positive aspects of freedom that maybe we didn't touch upon before I get to the last two tables? And you guys can chime in too at the end. Talked about freedom of worship, freedom of religion, freedom of self-determination to an extent. Anything else that you just want? There's not right or wrong here. It's just to help us in a seminar format.
I think a very real way in America that freedom is used in a good way is that I don't think there's any kind of law or stipulation that ever stops us from choosing that which is good. We have the ability to choose that which is good, and it's not been made illegal. No one's forcing someone to have an abortion. They can choose to do the good thing. We're skirting that line, with paying and funding and being mandated by the federal government, but we're not to a point where someone is being forced to do that which is evil because it is the law. And
so what you're saying is we have freedom of conscience still,
yes,
at a certain level. And tyranny is when that goes away,
yeah.
which is what, historically that was part of what the revolution was about in this country, was tyranny, which was very interesting. Thanks, Mike, for that. Okay, what would you guys like to share? What question, what would you like to share for the good of the group?
We focused mostly on question number 4.
Okay.
And one of the things that came up in our discussion was the allegory of the cave, and how sometimes, us and students alike begin to perceive what we might call the darkness or the struggles in their life as reality. And so when you say, like, hey, it's not how it's supposed to be, they don't get it. They just think, well, this is how it is. Whether it's the social anxieties of the peer groups, whether it's, brokenness or abuse that occurs in the home, they just get this sense of this is what life is like. And so when you say, no, that's darkness, it doesn't necessarily, make sense to them. So we talked about how do you break through that. And one of the first and primary ways we thought is that by creating environments in our schools that are joyful, And that's kind of the ray of light that might break into them and say, hey, what I experience at home doesn't have to, like my life doesn't have to be like that. There's people here that I encounter in school, that have something that's missing from my immediate family maybe, or my social group. And I think that that's a powerful witness that we can have, among, whether it's the faculty, or with the students and the ministry teams. If people experience a taste of joy, a taste of heaven, it could be that ray of light that kind of cracks in and helps them begin to see that their life shouldn't be like this, that there's something missing. And then that kind of tills the soil for us to use the Christian language and talk about our relationship with Christ, talk about how prayer sustains us in challenging times, and to go deeper on that level. I think that's predominantly what we spoke of.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
I can't remember his name. Running back for the Vikings.
Adrian.
Yeah, he's the exact example that, like, I'm saying the poor guy in the sense of he got his butt crushed by his dad, as a kid when he got whipped, right? He said that. He learned this is how you discipline a child, because that's how he was disciplined. And nobody ever told him otherwise. See, honestly, in his mind, didn't know that wasn't the way things were supposed to be. So he thought that was reality. This is how you discipline a child. And he said, I am not a child abuser. He really believes that. But to our standards, he is. So on the one hand, that's a good example of what you're saying. I do want to say this point. Luke, you said you wanted a challenge. I never romanticize the past, ever, ever, ever. So, 1950s, 1960s, that was okay to do that. And everybody accepted that. I'll never romanticize the past. I think we live in the lightest time today because we have less child abuse. The priest abuse scandal being another one. Racism is at a low point in history because of the internet. Like the young people, they see all this variety. They know it from day one. For instance, I'm just giving the other side of the whole thing. Like I think today is actually a light age thanks to the internet in many ways. I don't deny the darker times too, but I also think it's the opposite at the same time.
So the danger of romanticizing the past too much to not see where we've gone.
Yeah.
That's very good. I want to touch with this imagery of like the cave when we're talking about this. Just imagine what you were saying, the cave. They don't know the light. So how do you take them to the light? Now, if someone was in solitary confinement for like 30 days, and was in pitch darkness, would you take them into the sun right away? So from a pastoral point of view, how we work with young people, how we evangelize, it's relational. It's an approach that, we don't just hit them over the head with dogma or, I'm not saying you don't use dogma either, but I'm just saying that you have to look at that approach, bring them into the light gradually if you need to, because they may not, they may not even know they're in darkness. How do you get someone into the light that doesn't even know they're in the darkness to begin with? That's
Sherry Waddell's work that you mentioned earlier talks a lot about that, thresholds, identifying where people are. In the conversation you might have with one student or faculty member might be a little bit different than one you have with, a different student or faculty member. But kind of us as leaders in the school, student leaders and faculty leaders, being able to kind of discern where people are, and like you said, like identify the right word at the right time, so as to not shock someone back into the dark hole again because it's more comfortable.
That's interesting stuff. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you guys for sharing. Last table, and then we'll bring it home and get on our way.
We discussed 2 and 4, but we sort of touched base on the whys instead of the what's and the hows. We were discussing on why it is how people are these days. And a big thing that we were talking about is the fear of the unknown. Because in Christian freedom and how us Christians try to bring light to the darkness is talking about the afterlife. So like the culture itself just says, do what you want now on the earth, but us as Christians, we're focused on what's going to happen to us after this life, because this life doesn't belong to us. Father brought up a good quote from Scripture that I had the opportunity to lecture at the Mass last month or whatever, and it talked about how athletes, they do so much to train for these different crowns and trophies and stuff like that, but we as Christians are going after an imperishable crown. while, you know, this crown or whatever will be satisfying for, say, a year or whatever until next year's Super Bowl, you know, as Christians, we're talking about forever, eternity. And
No, I mean, I think that he hit the nail on the head. That's what we talk about.
Yeah, so we have to have our priorities kind of in line with where we're going. I think that again gets back to this whole point of the difficulties of Christian vision of freedom. You know, if you're in the dark and you don't know that you even need to be saved from anything, then, you know, how are you responsive to the idea of a Savior? That's a question I've been struggling along with the last couple of years in ministry, because I see that, you know, people, what do we need Christ for? Not saying that we don't understand what we need Christ for, but if you're taking someone who's doesn't have a relationship with the Lord, isn't baptized or isn't catechized, they have no idea why, or even why would you need Christ? Right? Because we've got everything we need. That idea, what you said, the secularism, what was the one that you were talking about? The age of the light of accomplishment or technology, right? We've got everything we need, right? This is all there is. So, I really appreciate you all for coming to this, and we will have this video. I hope to put it on the website so that you can refer back to it, listen to it, and the Facebook page, HS Ministry Teams. If you find that and like it, or I think you have to ask to join it, I'll get you on the list. But we can talk about these things and share some of these ideas more. You know, please feel free. It's not going to be a required kind of forum, but I'm going to see how this goes, see if we can build some energy here, and we get enough people on it, checking back, sharing information and feedback, then, you know, we can continue this discussion. In the next ministry in service, I'm hoping to build off of this and to take this and to talk about how do we make stories stick, given what we've talked about today. So the March one will be kind of tied into this. So March 11th, 2015, 3 to 5, same bath station, same location. All right, so let's just say a quick prayer, quick Our Father, and ask for God's blessings on our trip together, on our trip home today. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us.